This is a prelude by Giuseppe Torelli, which appeared in London in 1702. Now, talking about late 17th century music, divorced from other artistic activities in many ways is kind of ridiculous. I find it very, very difficult. And one of the problems I have with a lot of musicological activity is, for instance, it tends to do that. So what I'm going to do today is talk about the circumstances in which that appeared and the collection it was part of. But I thought it would be a good idea, because we've got people with literary interests here, to match that up with a bit of poetry from a few years earlier. And before I read it, I want to say that one of the things that fascinates me about all music and the way it works is its relationship between the way that speech and particularly poetry works. And just to remind us all that you can't begin to look at practically any classical music with its broadest definition without thinking of some of the rules of poetry, which sometimes we tend to kind of gloss over. So I'm going to read a poem by the great Aphra Behn, who is one of our most important literary figures. In some ways, she's the first person who can almost lay claim to have written a novel. She died in 1689, a few years before this was published in London. She's buried in the cloisters of Westminster Abbey. As a woman writer, she wasn't allowed into Poets' Corner, but if you come out of the door from Poets' Corner into the cloisters, you step right over her. She was very much part of the most active and lively artistic community in London. She was in love with Purcell's brother, Daniel, and she was a great friend and associate of Earl of the notorious poet Earl Rochester. And if you don't know who Rochester is, I almost feel nervous about sending you to his poems, because they are pretty much unprintable even to this day. I think someone there probably knows what they're like. A few years ago at Christmas, my wife gave me a new volume of them, and my mother was there, reached out for the volume to look at it, and I said, that would take me about 50 years of therapy to get past you reading that in front of me, so no. So this is the poem I'm going to read by Aphra Behn is called Love in Fantastic Triumph Sat. But I want to just remind ourselves of some of the constituent elements of both music and poetry at this time. This poem is a tetrameter, so it's in 4 feet. And in many ways, late 16th century, particularly solo music like that, there's a direct equivalency between bar lengths and feet, or at least or beats. Bum, bada, bum, 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 works very much like feet. And it's just, again, I know most of you know what I'm saying, but reminding ourselves of the various elements, the fact that a foot in classical poetry, in 17th century poetry, will either be iambic, so it will go dit da, or it will be trochaic, which means it goes da dit, or it will be a spondy, which means it goes da da, or it'll be a dactyl, ba ba da, or it'll be an anapest, ba da ba. You know, these are the elements which make up our music, and they make up poetry as well. And there's which means that you almost can't read or hear one without getting into the other. And we're going to use that as a little Vorspiel for what I want to talk about. So this is Aphra Behn's Love in Fantastic Triumph Sat. Love in fantastic triumph sat, whilst bleeding hearts around him flowed, for whom fresh pains he did create, and strange tyrannic power he showed. From thy bright eyes he took his fire, which round about in sport he hurled. But 'twas from mine he took desire, enough to undo the amorous world. From me he took his sighs and tears, from thee his pride and cruelty, from me his languishments and fears, and every killing dart from thee. Thus thou and I, the god, have armed and set him up a deity. But my poor heart alone is harmed, whilst thine the victor is, and free. That seems to have been written after the breakdown of her relationship with Daniel Purcell. She fell very, very happily in love in a way we'd recognise from a modern point of view shortly after this, when she was in her early 40s. She's an amazing writer and an amazing character. So, what I want to look at today is what's highlighted in the resource page I sent to you, which is a collection published probably between 1700 and 1704 by the first publisher, John Walsh. Later will be very associated with Handel. The reason I'm saying sometime between 1700 and 1704 is that the edition we have is the second edition from 1705, which was augmented by a supplementary piece at the end, which I'm not very interested in. Now, what's fascinating about this is it's the first opportunity we have practically anywhere of a publisher publishing a kind of cornucopia of violin playing, composing and improvising at the time. It's the most extensive state or survey we have of the state of string playing or instrumental playing to appear in the turn of this new century. If I just read down the list of composers, we have Corelli, Torelli, Kozumi, Bieber, Bononcini, that's Bononcini the Elder, Matteis, Gasparini, Haim, Keller, Albinoni, Corbett, Eccles, Vitali, Pepusch, Lonnati, Purcell, Simons, Bassani, Ziani, Gottfried Finger, and all the rest are repeats. Let's get to where I want to be. The piece you just heard from Torelli, is the piece which closes the cycle after 34 pages. And these are all pieces for violin alone. Now, the first thing to say when you're looking at a cycle of pieces, it doesn't matter to what you're looking at, it's to think about how they've been presented, how they've been organised. It's very clear to me that Walsh gave very careful consideration to order. Now, it's going to say something really odd. The end of the 17th century, two things had happened to do with collecting. One was there was a new idea of ordering things, which has resulted in the middle of the century in the UK with the first real attempt at a dictionary in 1658 by Edward Phillips, his New World of English Words, which is, and this may sound strange to say, it was a new thing. It was alphabetical. It wasn't quite sure what it was. In some ways, it's more of a gazetteer than a dictionary, and it's on the edge of being almost like a museum collection. On the subject of museums, there were more ramshackle kind of hodgepodge ideas. Now, some of you may know the figure John Aubry, who's famous for Aubrey's Lives, which was the first attempt at writing a collection of short biographies, which he wrote over a 30-year period in the 17th century. That wasn't collected, wasn't published, but his Miscellany in 1696 was published, which was completely disorganized kind of rattlebag of whatchamacallits, if you like. He actually described Aubrey described it as his dilettancy, not delinquency, but taking the word dilettante and editing on the front of delinquent and dilettancy. He described himself as dilettante. This is the beginning of museums, but museums and collections were ramshackle affairs. The most famous in London was a man called Thomas Dredescant, who's most famously associated with what is now the Natural Garden Museum down by what was Wolsey's Palace of Lambeth Palace, where he's buried, and Elias Ashmole, who founded the Ashmolean Museum around about the same time by stealing the collection from Dredescant. And these were kind of more like sort of ramshackle assemblages, much in the way you would expect if you, say, went to a German palace and you went into the Schatzkammer or the Kunstschrank, collection of beautiful objects. So Kunstschrank literally means art cupboard. In many ways, it was just a cabinet full of stuff, which in Italy was sometimes referred to as studioli, the place where you go in order to see and consider interesting things, but with no real particular order to them. We're in a almost over, well, half a century before the absolute revolution of what Linnaeus was going to do in Sweden. When Linnaeus comes up with a system of classification for plants, it basically changes everything. And the way things are ordered, even you could see in the way that music is ordered, will be affected by this thereon. So the challenge is, how does a publisher bring order to something which is disordered in a time when people weren't really quite sure what order was? As I said, there are 35 composers. They're either, in 1700 and 1701, they were either resident in London or not resident in London. And those who were resident divided themselves, looking back afterwards, between those whose, I can use the word, settled status proved permanent, i.e. they came here and died here, and those who went home afterwards. And likewise, composers who were not living in London from the collection are split between those who visited and those who never did. The interesting thing with people who left London is they can be divided again between whether they left because as a choice, i.e. made enough money, which until the 19th century was the only real reason musicians came to London, was because you could make more money playing music in London than anywhere else in the world, or they left because of a change of fortune. And if you know your second half of 17th century European history, everything after 1648 is going to be about regime change. In the UK, obviously, you've got the end of the Commonwealth and the return of Charles II in 1660, and the death of Charles II in 1683, which precipitates the return of, well, his brother, who makes the country Catholic again, and his fall in 1688, followed by the strange double Dutch monarchy of William and Mary, followed by Queen Anne. Now, what's not generally said is that meant every time that happened, every single musician who might be associated with any of those people, whether or not they were English-based visitors or not, lost their jobs overnight. Like, it's like everyone clearing out the White House. You simply aren't there anywhere. So that means you've got a very interesting relationship between who stays and not. Now, so we ask ourselves the question, what techniques does a publisher use? Well, this is the title page. And some interesting things it says on here is it says that in the, it's not this one. Yeah, it announces on this extremely terrible engraving. I mean, it's the engraver who worked for Walsh engraved a number of title pages, and whereas other engravers working for other publishers were accomplished, this person could basically just about hold the engraving all. It's dreadful but interesting. And it says, select preludes and voluntaries for the violin by the most eminent masters in Europe. And on the other title page, it says, made and contrived, which is something to keep in mind, for the improvement of the hand, with a variety of compositions by all the greatest masters in Europe for that instrument. So the contrived is a little bit of giveaway, but he's basically promising an incredible kind of embarrassment of riches of the greatest masters to improve the hand. Improving the hand is something which is used a great deal in music at that time. You get it most often, curiously, in English publications, in Italian, per far il mano, literally to make the hand, the idea that there was a kind of, it wasn't just technique, it was associated with elegance and with rhetoric. They're not just studies, if you like. What's interesting about the list of pieces, and I have it here, I may not, is that it includes, and this is a first, unlike previous publications, and Walsh took over from the two generations of Playfords, John and Henry Playford, who had published an epochal series of publications for amateurs, including a book called The Division Violin, which was published in 1684. This was a kind of successor to. But what was new here was there was a list of keys. Nobody had ever done that before. You won't be able to see anybody referring to what keys things are in. Of course, we all know, if you think about what's happening to music in the 17th century, that is important, because the sense of key taking over from other notions of how you define things harmonically is very, very important. Of course, you could argue that this was a practical thing. If players were needing to select things to use in an evening of music, the fact there were keys, and secondly, also quite radical at this time, page numbers meant it was very practical. I've probably talked about it far too much, but the adding of page numbers to music was a very spotty affair. It began in the 13th century, but unfortunately that ended quite soon because choir masters were very worried that if their choirs, if their charges, which are the boys in their choir, saw numbered pages, numbering pages or numbering anything was seen to be God's work, then they might fall into sin. So there are many late medieval choir books which had numbered pages where the corners have been cut off in order to avoid falling into all kinds of danger. Of course, as you might expect, the range of keys is limited. There's always a question in a tonal environment, and I think that's really important. What can a solo violin do without being sounding strained? Now, you might say that's very much of its time, but I've experienced that myself. When great David Matthews, nearly 20 years ago, started writing me a set of Preludes and Fugues in 3 and 4 parts for the violin alone for me, he said quite soon into the process that he had to limit himself to just 15 keys. He's writing tonally, because beyond that, I promise you, an extended fugue in F sharp major for the violin is going to sound quite unpleasant if you're writing tonally quite soon. And if you think about it, Bach only wrote fugues in what you might call open keys. So the first fugue, the G minor, and interestingly, of course, Bach wrote G minor with only 1 flat because he's a melodic, so he's always used rising melodic third. So it means that G minor for Bach uses all the open strings. His second fugue is in A minor, and the third is in C major. So by Bach's standards, Walsh's collection is very adventurous. There are 5 pieces in D major. We have D major, E major, A major, D minor, F major, F minor, A minor, B flat major, G minor, E flat major, E major, C minor, and C major. There's 13 keys, which actually, again, this might sound is a lot. In fact, you'd normally only expect a collection of 13 sonatas, or 12 sonatas, to maybe use 6 major and 6 minor. So it's 1 more key than you'd expect. It's quite rare to find solo works in F minor in this period, but there are 2. Again, if you're thinking about ordering things, and you go through the list, what's really interesting is the list has kind of zones of light and dark keys. The first 15 preludes are sharp and open keys, beginning in D major and finding their way to D minor. The next 5 are what you might call closed, or to use the way that you describe it in the 17th century, flatted keys. So basically, then you go to B flat, D minor, dark keys. They go from B flat to D minor, and then where to go? Okay, 22 to 28 is really interesting, and I do think there's a point here. There's a kind of muscular to and fro between going A major and E major on one side and F minor and E flat major on the other side. If you think that from a composer's point of view, having those 2 things running to each other. And the last 6 climb a kind of scale of flatted major and minors from B flat to D minor, gets to C major, and then finishes on the C minor prelude you just heard. And what's really interesting, once you've noticed this, you remember that Walsh has promised eminent masters. So the work begins with the past master, as he was perceived in 1705, Corelli, although he didn't die until 1715, he was the old guy, ends with a modern master, Matthäus, who was the most celebrated British-based violinist of this age, although he was Italian-born. Although he died before Corelli, he was younger, so he was seen as the modern master. So greatness was clearly a consideration in the ordering. Now, if you're thinking about a set of 34 pieces and your movements, looking for where you might find the heart, you would presumably, if you're thinking classical, Baroque, you're going to think, well, I'll go for the golden section. You go for the 20th, 21st movement. And you go to the 21st movement, what do you find? You find a G minor prelude by Henry Purcell, who died in 1695. I don't have any problem with saying that's being placed in the place of honour. That's exactly where you'd expect to find it. So I think one of the best ways to kind of explore a group of pieces is, like going to a museum, is to walk through them and observe what you can. And the important thing about doing this, of course you miss things on the way. You can't describe anything, and there's a virtue in this. I'd like to I'm going to point out some things about the characters as we go, because it is interesting to see what's there, and there are issues to do with the origins of the pieces. This is going to be irritatingly quick. The first of them is a D major prelude by Corelli, beginning this way. This kind of thing. Now, this seems to be an original work, and in the time that this was being published, no work of Corelli had ever been heard live in London as far as we know. So this was a new thing, though he'd been talked about a great deal, and one of his pupils had seemingly just arrived. And within a few years, the publisher was going to be publishing loads of Corelli. But it's worth talking about character. This character in violin music is imitating trumpets. And it's a trope all the way through the 1600s and 1700s of violins imitating trumpets, which is no longer fashionable. So you've got lots of pieces by, say, Vitali go. You get loads of those. Colombi wrote 10 or 11 of them. And if you think the most famous late example of that, that would be 1674, Mozart. Is apparently complaining in Salzburg that he wasn't allowed to use the trumpets in the orchestra when he wrote his concertos. So you'd expect the first thing to be a kind of upbeat. It's nothing terribly interesting musically about that. It's a cleaning of the ears. Then suddenly we have another piece by Torelli, a beautiful E minor prelude. Now, immediately we start thinking about how things are coming to the UK. Torelli began his career in Bologna as a member of the Bologna Philharmonic Academy, and I think that this is one of the occasions where, if you imagine you want to publish things, and this is an incredible piece of music, and I do urge you to go and listen to it. This is one of the things where Walsh knew he had an extraordinary piece of music on his hands, and I can say that it's absolutely as good as the works which Bach was going to use, in many ways copying Torelli afterwards. There's an amazing E minor Bach sonata for violin with continuo, not one of the cycle of six, which is clearly coming from this language. And Bach, like it, just as much as he arranged quite a lot of Vivaldi and Marcello, arranged for organ a Torelli work as BWV 979. If you push on, then we come to a scrap of music by Bieber. It's almost nothing, but this is the first breath we have of Bieber in the UK. We know him very much now, but there wouldn't be any more Bieber published anywhere until the middle of the 19th century. And there's no evidence whatsoever of anybody knowing anything about him in the UK, but clearly he was famous enough to be included here. And this brings us to this first question of the fact that Walsh is talking about things being made and contrived. Now, one of the really great things about being a little bit of a sort of detail hound is that it doesn't take long to work out how the composer's done it. Publishers in Europe in the 1690s would be getting advanced copies of things. And in 1681, a collection had appeared from Bieber called Sonate Violino Solo, and they'd been published in Salzburg. And there was plenty of material finding its way from Salzburg through France to the UK. And we know the copies were circulating in the UK because 70 years later, Burney, in his General History of Music, says Charles Burney, wrote that these sonatas have been circulating very early onwards. Now, the Walsh Prelude consists of absolutely clearly, he's done two things. He took the finale of the presto of the first sonata, which is in A major, and you can clearly see that as he was looking at it, he'd looked at the first movement of the following sonata, which is in a kind of D Dorian, and basically mixed them up. He's made a sort of slightly little 2-minute long Frankenstein's monster. That's the obvious thing we're seeing. But with all of these things, I think it's worth remembering that when musicians were working in an improvising context, what a musician publishes will always be relative to what they played and what they improvised. So we have to be careful. When I see something and I think it might have been an instance of plagiarism or piracy, there is the utter possibility that this is something which somebody had Bieber said to them, not as much as you might go to, albums in the following 2 centuries are full of people writing out quotes from their own music. So perhaps Bieber wrote it out for somebody, or even possible they heard Bieber do this. They wrote it down. If you think about jazz players playing, improvising, have a tendency to do things they've done before. With the greatest respect in the world, there's very few jazz players playing a lick who play a lick off the top of their head. I think it's absolutely the way the 17th century worked. So it wouldn't be impossible that somebody heard Bieber do it, write it down, and send it to Walsh. So then you get into kind of interesting problems to do with assumptions. Now, the first time I mentioned that there were the following prelude was by a Bononcini to somebody, immediately people started saying to me, that's the famous Bononcini who, was Handel's rival. Well, and Bononcini was part of the great kind of quarrel there was between kinds of opera composing in the 1720s in London between Handelian opera and Italian opera. And it's the origin, curiously, of the expression Tweedledee and Tweedledum. But he didn't arrive till 1720. And what you're seeing here is by his father, Giovanni Maria Bononcini. So you have to be careful. Then we get to the kind of the superstars. We next have a piece by Nicola Matteis. And I can never really say too much about Matteis. Matteis is absolutely extraordinary. And I'll just give you a breath of this. This is Matteis Prelude. Now, when Matteis first appeared in London, he was heard by the greatest diarist of the age, who was not Samuel Pepys, but John Evelyn. And Evelyn said that when he heard him, he never heard mortal man exceed on the instrument. He had a stroke so sweet, it made it speak like the voice of a man. But, and this is where it gets complicated, by the time this collection had appeared, Walsh, who'd made so much money that he retired on it. He disappeared, and by 1705 there was debate as to whether or not he was alive or not within London. He'd retired to the countryside he's certainly dead by 1712, but when people disappear from public life, he disappeared very comfortably. You couldn't check it out. You couldn't check somebody out on the web, and you couldn't ring somebody up. There was discussion as to whether he was alive or not. I want to then jump ahead a little bit and talk about something which is a vital element in the whole of this process, because you want to think about, well, how was music being circulated? And a crucial part of this in the late 1600s was something which was relatively new and appeared at the end of after the end of the 30 Years' War, which ended in 1648. And that was what would come to be known as the Grand Tour. So by the middle of the 1700s, it was absolutely de rigueur, initially for young gentlemen, but by the end of the 1700s, by adventurous women as well. in between, well, if it was men matriculating university and then if they were gentlemen beginning their careers, which might or might not involve actual work, to spend a couple of years ambling across Europe, basically to Italy and coming back. The very first use of the term Grand Tour was, as I remember, in a novel published by a dissipated Catholic priest called The Voyage of Italy in 1670. Now, of course, part of the tour was the obvious things. They'd have their portrait painted hanging around the Capitoline Hill or the Colosseum in Rome. And it was very acquisitive. The most famous modern instance of the Grand Tour in cinema history is what Citizen Kane does after he gets married. There's a great line that says, if he sends any more statues back from Italy, there won't be any left there. That's actually kind of modelled on what happened, was rich young men would go off and they'd buy antiquities or they'd buy the new art and they'd send it back in anticipation of what was going to happen when they reached their majority and had their own house. And it was also assumed that, and this relates to what I mentioned to earlier about what happened when, say, regime changed, the same thing would happen when the head of a household in a stately home changed, which would be there would be a tendency for all of the associated artists and musicians and general hangers-on, not the staff, but the ornaments of the place would be changed over. So it was seen as being absolutely normal that gradually you bring back painters and you would bring back performers. This goes back a long way. In the middle of the century, the Earl of Arundel had brought back the amazing Bohemian engraver Wenceslas Hollar, whose work you may know. That's how Inigo Jones had found his way to the UK. He came in the suite of the daughter of Christian IV of Denmark, who married Anne. She married King James, and Wenceslas Hollar arrived, and the first thing he did was to build the Queen's House in Greenwich and changed everything about British architectural history. But it's also worth remembering that a must-see on the Grand Tour in Rome, where you had to go, was the Pantheon. In the 17th century, there were only 3 tombs in the building, all of them painters, Carracci, Peruzzi, and of course Raphael. By 1713, they were joined by a musician. Corelli was buried, the ultimate place of honour. Now, I just want to tell a brief story here about one of these characters, because it is relevant to here. Because the first tweak of this we hear is the name in the collection, Haim, which curiously has been spelled Hyme. This is not. This is the Italian gambist and continuo player Haim, Hayme, who came as a gambist or continuo player to an Italian violinist called Nikola Kozumi, who's very much in the collection. But this is the reason. In 1696, a man called Wriothesley Russell, the Earl of Tavistock, left Magdalen College, Oxford. Now, 2 years later, he would begin, bear in mind he was 16, by 18, he was beginning his first building project, which was he built Greenland Dock in Deptford. The huge dock. I mean, what's interesting about this period was that people did not, some of them lived long, but people were making the most extraordinary achievements very, very early on. He'd finished that project by the time he was 19. But in the meantime, he spent 2 years in Italy, traveling there and back. While he was there, he discovered the Italian violinist Kozumi, and we think began conversations which resulted in him bringing Kozumi back to London at the end of 1700, which is the reason it was then, was because that's when he ascended to the seat of the Duke of Bedford, succeeding his grandfather. Now, just to kind of raise the temperature here, just to let you know the reason he succeeded his grandfather, not his father, was that in 1683, and when he was 2.5 years old, his father had been executed by Charles II for his part in the so-called Rye House plot. But somehow his grandfather and his mother had managed not to have the land taken away from him, which meant the grandfather had to hang on. He managed to hang on until the young Earl got old enough, and then he died very neatly in time for him to become the new Duke of Bedford. Now, I've been quite intrigued as what it was which might make, for instance, a young noble go into business with a publisher. Because one of the things we all know is the one things that in the 17th and 18th century, nobles were not supposed to do or talk about was to be either be paid for or to be talk about being paid for anything. Simply not acceptable. In fact, a few years later in Holland, there was a Count Enrico Graf von Wassenaer, who was actually a composer of some genius, whose a Kapellmeister said, you have to publish your music, and he refused. And he said, well, you can publish it if you want as your own. So the music master, called Ricciotti, published it as his own. Nobody bought it. So the music master published it again as being by Pergolesi, then everybody bought it. And quite a lot of that music found its way into Stravinsky's Pulcinella. So the reason was there was absolutely no way that Wassenaer could be seen to be engaged in anything which might associated with selling his work. But what might make a young noble do something which involved being paid for something? And my immediate reaction, well, we know that what most of nobles spent their time doing when they travelled to Italy was not looking at art, was being extremely drunk gambling. And it just happens that his mother, Lady Rachel Russell, published an autobiography in 1723, which talked about the fact that there's quoted letters coming back from the son saying, I'm in terrible debt gambling. Can you send me money, but please don't tell Grandad. Now, one would also assume that then it would be very much in their interest to start gathering material, which they might, for instance, sell to publishers. And I would like to suggest that probably one of the ways, prior to musicians going backwards and forwards that much, was these kind of slight under-the-table deals. So in 1701, Nikola Kozumi arrived, and not alone, as I said, he brought with him this cellist, this continuo player, Haim. Because if you're going to set up a capelle, a group of musicians in a stately home, a violinist is not much use to you. What you need is a continuo player. And so consequently, 2 years later, when Kozumi left, Haim stayed and became very much a distinguished career, not just as a harpsichordist, but as theatre manager, a director, and a composer and a writer. You get some quite comic things. So, for instance, the next, not musically that interesting, the next one is by another continuo player. It is interesting in terms of grouping that Haim is immediately followed by a man called Godfrey Keller, who's also a continuo player, was listed amongst the musicians who in 1695 were going to form the staff of what was proposed to be a Royal Academy of Music. It floundered, it didn't happen. And the other keyboard player listed as a teacher there was Henry Purcell. The most distinguished thing for me about Godfrey Keller is that in 1696 he was married in a church not far from where I'm sitting. A lot of these composers are very closely associated with the Square Mile, which is very much part of my life, and he was married in a church of St James's Duke Place, which is no longer there. But if you know where Aldgate Station is, there is a church there, St Botolph's. Next to it is a school that's called the John Cass School. The footprint of the John Cass School is where St James's Duke Place stood. And by the end of the 1600s, the church had almost completely fallen to pieces, because by the end of the 1600s, it was also the centre of London's Jewish community. In fact, the first authorised synagogue to be built in England, although there was an earlier one called the Great Synagogue, not far away, but the first authorised one, Bevis Marks, still stands behind it. But of course, it being in the middle of the Sephardic Jewish community come from Spain meant nobody was going to church. But the church was very busy, because as it was officially outside the walls of London, therefore outside the reach of the Bishop of London, it became the place where you could get married without banns being read. Between 1691 and 1699, wait for it, 40,000 couples were married there, amongst whom was Godfrey Keller. They're literally hundreds a week sometimes, and not surprisingly, eventually the church was closed. I'd like to jump to an idea now, which is to do with more of this question of plagiarism. A few Preludes on, we get to this, which the moment I heard it raised a question on my mind. It begins like this. It says it's by Albinoni. Etc. Now, you have to be pretty much deaf not to hear that that's a concertante style. You know, that is absolutely Venetian, concertante style. And I realized I played it. It's from Albinoni's Concertos Opus 2. Those bars I just played are the opening of the concerto. I think that Walsh was able to take advantage of the fact that publishers became able to control the flow of music across Europe. It's clear to me that, well, one possibility is that Walsh had a copy of the Opus 2 Albinoni, because we know this, because in 1709, guess what? He published it. What happens musically in the prelude is after those first 4 bars, which are identical to the first 4 or 6 bars of the concerto, then the prelude goes off and does something else. So we have various possibilities. And I do think these are worth rehearsing. One is that one of Walsh's or his associates attained a set of parts, and Walsh or one of his associates continued it like a caprice, if you like. Secondly, as a musician who either heard or played in a concert, wrote down what they remembered, and then made up the rest. Or, as I've already suggested, it was that the composer himself was the source. And there's one thing to point out here, which is that Albinoni, like Pergolesi, was going to be somebody who was much more celebrated, and was celebrated for a lot of music that they didn't write, and was celebrated in some ways disproportionately for their influence at the time. Both Albinoni and Pergolesi never had official positions. Albinoni's reason was that he was independently wealthy, so he didn't need to take work. And that meant that he stands at an odd angle to the other Venetian composers. But in 1700, 1701, he was only 30 years old. He hadn't achieved that kind of status where it was really in somebody's interest to plagiarize a piece of his. So I'm in two minds about this. I'm beginning to think that maybe we've got something where this was somebody who met him in Venice and said, would you like to contribute to this, or just write me a short piece, if you like. Then we get to some even more interesting characters, more travellers. There is an extraordinary composer called Willian Corbett. Now, I got myself into a bit of a fight yesterday with somebody doing an interview, who started talking about the distinction between true English and non-English musicians. Now, as a Londoner, I find this really, really problematic, because the very definition of being English is that London in particular, is you come from somewhere else. I'm a melange of the leftover Sephardic Spanish Jews that I was just talking about, marrying into Huguenots, and those two families married into each other until into the 20th century. So I have Huguenot. My Huguenot name is Darcy. My wife, who's an Austen fan, never understood why the family would have got rid of that name, but there you are. So the idea that there's anything such thing as an English violinist is a problem. But Corbett's very interesting. The caprice of Corbett's actually begins with the earliest use we know of up-bow staccato. We know there's no earlier use of tension staccato in any violin music. But he's rather more interesting than just, if I can use the word, just the music. He had a rather mysterious life, because he was given a job on her accession as private violinist to Queen Anne. And in 1709, he travelled there and remained in Italy, where he took lessons. We know he took lessons with Corelli up till Corelli's death in 1712. But the most interesting thing is, why does a member of the royal family send somebody off to Italy? Now, in some cases, you have things like Charles II sent John Bannister, who is in this collection, to Paris, and to specifically to listen to Louis XV's 24 violons de roi, the 4 and 20 violins, and to see how good they were. And Bannister did this and came back and said that he thought his orchestra was better, and there's nothing could be learned from the French, upon which Charles II promptly sacked him. But There are other travelling musicians. We began with Afraben. Afraben was employed as a spy in Amsterdam in the 1670s, coming up to the early 1680s. And there's an interesting gender here thing. Her job was to get social gossip. But she reported back that the Dutch were planning on trying to invade southeast England. When she reported that back to London, she was told in no uncertain terms it was not her job to report such things, and she was promptly sacked. It didn't seem to go down that well when the Dutch did attack, resulting in the first big naval battles of Deal Sands, and eventually the Dutch sailing up the River Medway and towing the Royal Charles out sideways over the sandbar. So Afraben was a spy, and we all, you look at figures like Peter Paul Rubens coming to the UK, that's very much his job. I'll come back to the reason that Cobbett was spying a little bit later on, because it does actually relate to people here. But we also know that Cobbett knew everybody. He brought back violins from Italy. He brought back Corelli's violin, he brought back Lonnati's violin, and he brought back Torelli's violin. And he left them to Gresham College when he died. And then Gresham College got rid of them in 1751. In a few years ago, 2 years ago, I had the chance, and the recording is sitting on the source page there. I was contacted by Ingalls and Hayday, very well-known auctioneers in London, because they knew about my work on 17th century London. They said, "We've got one of Corbett's violins, would you like to play it?" And it was an amazing moment. I came along and found it was a violin by Girolamo II Amati. That is the grandson of this Amati, and wonderfully it was branded on the bottom of the violin WC for Willian Corbett. And we know, and this is, if you're like me, this is very exciting, this is one of the very few occasions we know of a traveller buying the violin direct from the maker. It's an amazing moment when you realise you're holding something where the first owner bought it directly from the Amati. So I'd just like to sort of push on a little bit to this question of why the spying. So one of the reasons was this, and it's linked to the questions of who is working where at court. In 1673, the then Duke of York, James, who I've already mentioned, the brother of Charles II, married his second wife, who is Maria de Modena. And she became queen, of course, in 1685 when he came to the throne. Now, as I've already said, every single monarch who came to the throne resulted in a change of musicians and artists. And one of the results of this was the German-born but Italian-based gambist Gottfried Finger came into the Royal Chapel. And in this case, it actually was the Royal Chapel because James reinstituted Catholic worship in the Royal Chapel on Whitehall. But this also gets more interesting because, of course, when he married Maria, her background was that she came from the linked cities of Maria and Bologna. And the musicians who were very much involved at Bologna include father and son, the Vitalis, Corelli, who I already mentioned, and Colombi. And as you might expect, there is a prelude here by Vitali. This is an instance of a musician who didn't come to London, but you can clearly see how music like this. And it's very different from the other ones. What's difficult for us is working out what defines virtuosity in any age. And one of the things which distinguished the Bolognese violins and the modern violins was leaping playing, which is going across the whole instrument. So that's a very typical bit of that writing, but this is where it gets kind of fun. Tommaso Vitali's father, Giovanni Battista Vitali, moved to the court in 1674 to take charge of the teaching of the Duke, who was 11-year-old Francesco. Francesco was Maria's younger brother and was a virtuoso violinist. He directed the orchestra. Much as I think he was truly talented, unlike what was going on in the Habsburg court at that moment. So it's pretty easy to understand that there was a link would be emerged between Francesca's older sister, who was also a musician, and the fact that he was not only studying with, but playing in the orchestra alongside those. And earlier I mentioned the figure Giovanni and Maria Bononcini, and politics was always part of this. Bononcini had been meant to have the job of the Maestro di Cappella, which Giovanni Battista Vitali took, and Vitali managed to swindle him out of the job. It's also interesting that we have a tendency to look at musicians and artists by what they become. So many of you will know the name of Johann Christoph Pepusch. Pepusch, is known to be a composer and teacher and directing the Drury Lane, the Opera House eventually, and also the director of music at the Foundling Hospital, where one of the earliest performances in London of Handel's Messiah was given. But in 1702, nobody knew who he was. He was literally working as a jobbing viola player in the Drury Lane Theatre. But we have here, it took me a moment to say, well, why is there something by this harpsichordist? Clearly string writing. But at that point, perhaps, Walsh was able to identify talent in somebody, and he had the very young Pepusch not very young, but in terms of his career, 2 pieces into this. Now, I think it's worth taking a kind of sidebar at this moment to just think about language. And the title of this book is Preludes and Voluntaries. And if you look at this, one thing I noticed here, if you look at the terrible engraving here, which is on your page, you'll notice that just here, there's a little piece of paper, and you should be able to see it says there, flourish in the key. Now, I mentioned earlier the early dictionary by Edward Phillips, 1658. And it's worth remembering that in the late 1600s, early 1700s, the amount of books which any one person might have or even have access to would be comparatively limited. When Locatelli died in the late in the 1700s, he left a library of 400 books. That was seen as a colossal library, because despite the fact there was a great deal of pamphleteering being published, you wouldn't own that many books. So when I went and looked up Prelude in Phillips's New World of English Words, and bear in mind that Walsh would have known the publishers who published the Phillips. It was published literally 3 blocks away. This was published, underneath what is now the Royal Exchange off Cornhill. Well, the Royal Exchange sits over the top of it. And Phillips's work was published in St Paul's Churchyard, which is conservatively 5 minutes walk away. He defines prelude in the following, in the Phillips. Prelude, a proem or entrance into discourse or subject, here we go, in music is taken for a voluntary or flourish in any instrument. And I don't think it's stretching it to think that perhaps the origin of preludes and voluntaries and flourish in the key on that title page may have been suggested by Walsh having access to the dictionary. I just think it's kind of fun to play with. We then run into another one of my favourite characters. This is Arcalo Ambrogio Lonnati. And his prelude is kind of mephitic. And it's full of kind of outbursts like this and very grumpy double stop and lots of arpeggios. And there's big leaping things. It's the most in terms of character, it is the most diverse of all of them. And it's worth saying, well, this reflects this man's career. And now we get back to the kind of Rome thing. He first appears in the Royal Chapel in Naples, where he would have known Matthias, because Matthias, although he had a German name, began his career in Naples. We also know that Purcell was influenced by Lonnati's music because he Purcell himself pirated some of Lonnati's sonatas and published them as being his in Playford's Introduction to the Skill of Music in 1694. In 1673, Lonnati began work in Rome as the Kapellmeister for the exiled Queen Christina of Sweden. This is where the fun begins to happen, because from the 16th century, by the mid-1680s, you have a whole series of exiled European monarchs who are holed up around the Vatican. And of course, by 1688, they would be joined by James II and his wife, who became what was known as the King over the Water. And the Vatican took great care to make sure that they held on to Catholic monarchs who could be used to be reinserted back into countries to destabilize them. At this time, Lonnati applied got the rather unsavory title of Il Gobbo della Regina, because he was short of stature, and it was fashionable for monarchs to have people who had dwarfism, as you know. If you think about Velázquez, he painted the famous I can't remember, Las Minas has one at the front of the picture. So part of the reasons for his celebrity was his stature. Also, he was celebrated as a comic actor, as a singer, and also, unfortunately, he was celebrated as a criminal and perhaps a murderer. He was implicated in some of the scandal around Stradella. He and Stradella were forced to leave Rome together when they were found to be embezzling money from the Vatican. And a few years later, Stradella was assassinated in Genoa. It's pretty likely that Lonnati was involved in that, because unfortunately, when Lonnati came to London with the castrato Giovanni Francesco, who had the pseudonym Siface. That castrato was in the service of Queen Maria, who I just mentioned. And on the way home, Siface was murdered on the road to Ferrara. Death and scandal seemed to accompany Lonnati absolutely everywhere he went. But I kind of think as one of the things which really fascinates me most about this is that these are very, very much larger-than-life characters. Now, I mentioned that at the centre of the collection was a piece by Purcell, and this is it. Now, of course, it's got all the hallmarks of the most famous aspects of Purcell, particularly that bass line. So here's my suspicion. Purcell died, as I mentioned earlier, in 1695. And I suspect that when he died, this fragment came into Walsh's hands. And by any stretch of the imagination, any stretch, it is beautiful. And I wonder if he thought, well, I've got to do something with this. Now, if we were at the Academy, we could walk down the road to the Wallis Collection. And the Wallis Collection is full of things like mother of pearl nautilus shells, which have been, in the 17th century, would have been carved and then set in gold and gilded and highly elaborated settings. And you get this a great deal if you go to the Waddesdon room of the British Museum. You'll see, for instance, there are things like vanilla pods, which were much prized, which have been similarly set. The idea you take something beautiful and natural and you put it, in sort of I know, mounted in silver and embossed and chased, and maybe you add figures like a figure of Pan on the top, all of these kinds of things. And I think in some ways you could say that this is what the collection is doing. It's taking this incredibly pure piece of Purcell and it is setting it. Then you get to situations where, as a kind of explorer in music, I fail. Because, we've got X number of 25 odd composers in here, and I managed to trace most of them. But what's really upsetting is when you have a piece like this, which is a piece which follows within this dark minor key, and Walsh follows it with this. Now that's a really fascinating piece of music, and it's labelled as being by Mr. Symons. I and nobody else can work out who Mr. Symons is. And I think there's a kind of reminder that at any given time, a city like London has been filled with extraordinary talent, and some of them will not succeed in being celebrated afterwards. There is another possibility, which I'm not willing to go to press with, which is the clue being in the name. Symons has a tendency to be the way that the Jewish name Shimon gets anglicized with an S on the end of it. I don't think it's stretching it, especially bearing in mind the quality of and the nature of the music, to suggest that perhaps the music came from a musician from London, so as I mentioned already, large Jewish community. That could be it. But again, I'm just simply, this is the first time I've ever said that in public, and I can't go any further than that. It reminds me of the thing that John Aubry, who I've referenced earlier, said about the problem of investigating history. He said, these antiquities are so exceedingly old that no book does reach them. There is no way to retrieve them. Now, here's where something gets really interesting. There is a E-flat prelude by Giovanni Batista Bassani. Now, Bassani is really interesting. He died in 1716 when he was 66. For some time, he was talked about as perhaps having been a teacher of Corelli's, but I don't think that's likely. He, like many of the other violinists, was associated with the court in Bologna. And this is an extraordinary little piece. I'll just play the beginning. Sorry. Etc. I really always love playing it. But I thought, okay, in the interest of me making sure that I don't get egg on my face, because we're about to release the recordings of these, I need to spend a day hauling through every single published bit of Bassani I can find just to check it's not. The interesting thing is, one of the great things about pirates and plagiarists, they don't bother changing the keys of things, ever. And the really great thing about suites as opposed to is that Baroque suites are nearly always remain in the same key for every movement. So it means that all I needed to do was to go through the 10 or 15 works by Bassani which were available, find the movement, the pieces were in E-flat, and see what I found. And sure enough, I found that he'd published in Modena his Balletti Correnti, Gighe e Sarabandi, his Opus 1 in 1677. Clearly, Walsh knew this really well and trusted nobody else did, because the prelude you just heard is just the first violin part of his Balletto Sesto, the first movement, with no alterations at all. And this is where it gets really interesting. What you just heard is a kind of decorative swag across the second violin, which is playing almost Lutheran chorale. So you have that kind of and bump, bump. You can imagine straight away how that works. And this, I kind of find myself in deep trouble here now, because it really works wonderfully by itself. I've already mentioned there are at least 3 occasions in the collection where Walsh extracted material to make solo works. And it's also eminently clear that if you look at Mateus, who I've talked about quite a bit, that he, along with other players, were perfectly comfortable with playing music notated, which they'd written from various instruments, with playing it completely by themselves. Or sometimes you get this in the Mateus editions we have, where the composer would prick in the notes using a pin for himself. So if you go and look at the 4th collection of Mateus airs, you'll see that underneath the violin line, pricked in the way that an artist would prick a painting to put charcoal through it to transfer it, are extra notes to make it more complicated so that it would be played alone. And let's be honest about it, Bach had no problem whatsoever in taking, for instance, this and using it as decorative material played on the organ for a cantata. So the to and fro between accompanied and not accompanied is simply not something which a composer of the 17th or early 18th century would have a problem with. I think we're very obsessed in these days with what's the correct scoring for something. And if you've seen the correspondence between Beethoven and the Scottish publisher G.S. Thompson, who of course famously was also Robert Burns' publisher, and the correspondence between the two of them about the folk song transcriptions which Beethoven, Haydn and Dussek were making for Johnson. And Beethoven made over 250 transcriptions for voices and piano trio. There were 2 stipulations from Thompson. One was that amateurs, really simple amateurs, should be able to play everything. And 2, that you should basically be able to remove any of the parts and still have something you could use. And it really works. You know, you can play the Beethoven things, you take out the piano part and it works. You take out the cello part and it works. It is the idea that our obsession with the correct instrumentation for something would pretty much be alien to anybody prior to the age of recording. Most people's experience of most people in the 19th century had never heard a symphony live, but they were very likely to have felt their way through it on a piano. You know, they wouldn't have thought that that in any ways was lesser. I mentioned earlier that there was a link to the square mile, and one of the things which is really interesting is the number of these players who held positions as directors of music in the very newly rebuilt churches which Wren, Hawksmoor and Robert Hooke had been rebuilding since 1670 in the square mile. Some of them weren't rebuilt churches. So one of the figures in the collection, who I'm not going to talk about today, is a man called Thomas Dean, who, by the way, is the first person we know to perform Corelli in London. We know nothing more about Dean than that, except for the fact that he was sacked as organist of the Holy Sepulchre Church in 1712. Here we have another example, the composer William Gorton, who so far we've not managed to prove whether he's a relationship of David Gorton, but it would be kind of fun for the year he was. We know he was a gamba player and an organist, and from 1702 he was the first director of music at an almost unknown Wren church, which still exists, but most people have never seen it, St Clement Eastcheap. And the reason most people have seen it is because it's not on Eastcheap anymore. It's tucked behind, it's tucked in a tiny corner. It's a little cube-like jewel box of a piece. He was the director of music there, and when he died, he was buried in there. And one of the things I can say about this music is one of the big discussions in sort of the HP departments is, where's the appropriate things to play things? And I've had quite some rows with people about whether it's appropriate to play this music in churches. What really interests me is that if you were living in central London, in the Square Mile, for instance, in 1700, you would be living in we're going to use the word, straitened circumstances. You wouldn't have that much room. The housing was very, very small. If you were a music director of a spacious church, there's absolutely no question that, for me, I never came across an organist who wouldn't play other stuff in the church they had a chance to. So the idea that Gorton wouldn't have got his gamba out and tried it in one of these acoustics is just complete nonsense to me. And what's really, the chance of doing that is really interesting, is when you go into these, and of the 80 that existed at the end of the 1700s, we have about 30 left now. Most of them, contrary to popular opinion, were not destroyed during the Second World War. Most of them came down in the 19th century when, because of the Industrial Revolution, particularly handcrafts left the city. Railways meant that there was no reason for instance, to have streets in the city that only had thread needlers or sold hay, so it meant that there was nobody to populate the churches. So probably around about 25 of these churches were knocked down between about 1840 and 1900. But the interesting thing is when you go into any of these churches, these acoustics teach you a lot about the pieces. And it's worth mentioning that both Wren and Hawksmoor not only collected instruments being made in London at this time, they were both musicians, but collected this very music. And Wren referred to his buildings, it's one of the few bits of writings we have from Wren, as auditories, literally hearing places. I'd like to kind of bring this to a close with the kind of problems that composers ran into. I mentioned earlier that the Moravian gamba player Gottfried Finger was briefly a member of James II's Kapelle. And in the last months of James's reign, this is literally the last months of 1688, the so-called Glorious Revolution, during which Judge Jeffreys was caught and arrested by a mob in a pub which is 50 metres from where I'm sitting right here. Finger dedicated his 12 sonatas to James II. Now, James II, as I mentioned, would soon become the king over the water. Now, Finger didn't have to leave London at this point, even though he'd lost his job, because along with quite a number of other musicians, one of the results of these regime changes was the birth. London was the first city, as most of you will know, to have private, non-patronised concert series. The first of these began in York Buildings, that 2 streets away from Villiers Street on the Embankment, in the York Buildings, promoted by Bannister in 1672, and these buildings where the musicians lived not only served as small concert halls but also as music shops. And famously in Clerkenwell, just north of the city, Thomas Britton, who made his money as the so-called small coals man, selling coal to individuals around the city, set up his famous music society there. So Finger was able to take part in both of these, but he did end up having to leave London for a bit of misjudgment. In 1701, there was a competition announced to set a play by Willian Congreve, The Judgment of Paris. And a number of composers entered. And this is where we kind of slightly return to a burgeoning celebration of Englishness. The other composers who entered were John Weldon, John Eccles, one of the Eccles family. There's a member of the Eccles family in this collection, but that's Henry Eccles, not John Eccles, and Purcell's brother Daniel. There were each of the composers' submissions as turning this play into an opera was given a performance, and the result was, at the end of it, Finger was gauged to have come fourth. Now, Roger North, who was another great documenter of musicians at the time, noted that Finger, quote, thought he was supposed to be judged by men and not by boys, thereupon left England and has not been seen since. And this brings us back to finish with Walsh. This had happened a year before this publication, The Preludes and Voluntaries, appeared. The second piece by Gottfried Finger, which is included in here, is not an original piece. It comes, and this is a great thing, as I've already mentioned about having so much material online. It took me 15 minutes to find that it is the third of his Opus 3 sonatas. Those are the sonatas that he dedicated to James II in 1688. And it also explains why, I'll just play the very end. Here's a smoking gun to finish with. So if you get to the end of a solo piece written in 1700, and the last chord is, and the last chord is a first inversion, that tells you pretty explicitly that it's been ripped off from something. It's missing a bass part. So I think that Walsh couldn't resist the opportunity of the fact that Finger had left under a cloud, was not likely to be litigious back into the UK, so he was able to lift something from that to complete his collection. So that's kind of my sort of, it's incredibly sort of shallow way of digging through something. I think it's worth thinking when you look at any collection of music, what the motivation of how it is collected, how pure the collection it is, and why we insist that it should be. So for instance, right now, I mentioned David Matthews earlier. That David Matthews has spent lockdown writing an opera. In my view, rather ill-advisedly, the opera is based on a libretto by Roger Scruton, and he and I are fighting about that big time because, Roger Scruton, not my favourite person. But there again, he's gone and written an opera on how he thinks it's ever going to be put on. I cannot imagine. Anyway, and he has sent me his new string quartet, his 14th. All his string quartets since his 10th have been written for us. And the 14th involves transcriptions of bits of the opera. And that's very common. It's absolutely, and there's nothing surprising in that. Composers are very, very practical people. And I think we can say that publishers historically have been, and whenever you see a collection, when you see an extended series of pieces, you can bet that those pieces will involve reused things. I like the fact that Eliot has just noted that there's a curio, I'm reading this, a curio in the ledgers of the Chapel Royal, where one year there weren't enough boy trebles who could sing Tallis's liking. And so, quote, "Oh, this is brilliant. Mr. Tallis had dismissed the boys and replaced their parts with viols and cornets. You have walked right into the absolute centre of this boiling issue and that's really it's a really exciting thing to finish with, which is when do things move from being instruments and into voices into instruments. So I've been talking a lot about the Royal Chapel, which is in the middle of the 17th century in the UK. Gradually, you start getting string instruments finding their way and replacing voices as opposed to wind instruments, which have been the habit before. And if you're a real nerd, you'll love observing how the king's private music in the 1600s, in the 1630s, the king's private music was all honking and whistling things. And by 1690, it was all bowed things, all working with voices. That's a really good, very nice observation. That's very nice to finish with.